The Galactic Council voted against Earth. It backfired. The number on the screen was 47. I had been staring at it for 3 seconds, which felt like 3 years. 47 civilizations, 47 votes, all of them against us. I did not move. I did not speak. I just let that number sit in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. My name is Mara Voss. I had spent 11 years of my life working toward this moment. I had learned 4 alien languages, studied the political history of 32 galactic species, and worn the same gray diplomatic coat so many times it had started to smell like recycled station air. I had done everything right. We all had, and it had not mattered even slightly. The council chamber of the Galactic Assembly was not built to make you feel welcome. It was a vast, curving hall of dark mineral and cold light, with tiered seating that rose so high the upper rows disappeared into artificial shadow. The species who sat in those rows had names that took minutes to pronounce correctly, and they had been governing interstellar civilization for longer than humans had been writing things down. I had been given a small observation gallery at the side, with a single chair and a translation earpiece. Not a seat at the table, a window to look through. That, I had thought when I arrived, told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. High Arbiter Vess of the Dravasi Confederation had read the charges with the calm of someone reciting a grocery list. Unpredictable evolutionary aggression, resource monopolization behavior, cultural contagion risk. Each phrase had been met with soft sounds of agreement from the chamber, the alien equivalent of nodding along. I had listened to all of it through my earpiece with my hands folded in my lap and my face absolutely still. The translator had struggled with cultural contagion risk and rendered it, after a pause, as the danger of influence spreading without permission. I had almost laughed. Almost. The vote had taken 11 minutes, 47 in favor of denial, 0 in favor of approval, 1 abstention. It was the abstention that I kept coming back to. The Dravasi system required a simple majority to deny membership, so the abstention changed nothing about the result. Earth's application for full council membership was rejected. In addition, and this was the part that the press releases back home would call a development, and that I was privately calling a slow suffocation, Earth was to be placed under a developmental quarantine. No authorized trade through council space. No transit rights. No diplomatic exchanges with full council members. The official language was careful and bureaucratic, and full of words like protective restriction and monitored separation. The practical meaning was very simple. They were cutting us off. I stood up from my chair when the session closed. My legs felt normal. My breathing was steady. A council aide, a young thoracy with pale blue scales and very large, careful eyes, came to escort me to the departure terminal. He was polite. He walked at a pace that was slightly too fast, the way someone walks when they want to hurry you without appearing to. I went with him without complaint. The corridor from the chamber to the transit wing was long and curved and lined with panels of living mineral that shifted color slowly, the way deep ocean water moves. It was genuinely beautiful. I noticed it the way you notice a painting in a house you are being asked to leave. Halfway down the corridor, I heard something behind me. I turned. The thoracy aide had stopped walking. He was looking past me at something further down the hall. I followed his gaze and saw, standing alone near a junction of 2 corridors, a Velhari elder. I recognized him from the council floor. He was the one who had cast the abstention. His name, according to my briefing file, was Sol. He was old by Velhari standards, which meant he had lived through 3 cycles of council reformation, and his eyes were the deep amber of someone who had seen enough of the galaxy to stop being surprised by it. He was looking at me. Not at the thoracy aide, not at the corridor, at me. There was nothing in his expression that I could confidently read. Velhari faces did not map onto human expressions in any reliable way, But there was something in the quality of his attention. It was not pity. Pity looks soft. This was precise. It was the look of someone who has run a calculation and is watching to see if the result matches their prediction. I held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then I turned and walked on. The shuttle back to the human transit station was a small, efficient vessel with no windows in the passenger cabin. I sat alone. The Thoracy aide had not come with me past the departure gate. I was, for the first time in 11 years of diplomatic service, completely without a role to perform. No language to speak carefully. No posture to hold. No face to manage. I sat with my hands on my knees and let myself think. They had been afraid of us. That was what all 3 charges came down to when you stripped the language away. Unpredictable aggression. That was fear of what we do when we are pushed. Resource monopolization. That was fear of how efficiently we work when we want something. Cultural contagion. That was the strangest one, and I thought it was also the most honest. They were afraid of what we were like as neighbors. They were afraid that proximity to humans had a tendency to change things, and that they could not control what those changes looked like. They were not entirely wrong about that. But here was the thing they had miscalculated. Here was the part that was going to matter in the months ahead. They had assumed that cutting us off was a punishment. They had assumed we would feel the quarantine the way a small species feels isolation, like being locked in a room with no food. What they did not understand, and what I was only now articulating clearly in my own mind, was that humans do not experience closed doors the way other species do. We experience them as problems, and we are very, very good at problems. I opened my personal terminal and drafted a single message to the Secretary of Earth's Department of Interstellar Affairs. It was short. It read, "They just handed us the war we didn't know we were already fighting. Be ready." I sent it. The shuttle docked 40 minutes later. I walked through the gate into the human transit station, and the lights were warmer there, and the air smelled like coffee from the small vendor near the gate, and someone had put a hand-painted sign on the wall that said "Welcome Home" in 6 languages, including 2 alien ones. I stopped in front of it for a moment. Then I picked up my bag and went to find a phone, because there was a great deal of work to do, and for the first time in a long time, none of it required anyone else's permission. I had been back on Earth for exactly 4 days when the secretary called me into a room that did not officially exist. It was on the 14th floor of a building in New Geneva that was listed publicly as a climate modeling center. It had the right equipment for that in the lobby, and 2 actual climate scientists worked there, and neither of them had clearance to use the elevator past the 3rd floor. The room on 14 had no windows, a long table made of real wood, which meant someone had thought this meeting was worth spending money on, and 7 people already seated when I arrived. I knew 4 of them. Dr. Leon Price was the head of Earth's Advanced Propulsion Division, a short man with paint-stained fingers who looked like he spent more time in a workshop than an office because he did. Admiral Grace Hewitt sat at the far end with her hands flat on the table and the expression of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Beside her was Oliver Strand, who technically worked in trade economics but actually worked in whatever needed to be done that could not be done officially. And there was Nadia Akoy, who was the best legal mind in the history of interstellar treaty law and who had, the previous year, submitted a 400-page brief proving that 17 Council trade regulations were internally contradictory. The Council had ignored it. She had smiled when they ignored it, which had worried me at the time and did not worry me now. The 3 I did not know were introduced as specialists. I would learn their names later. Right now, I was more interested in the folder in front of my chair. I sat down and opened it. The first page had 3 words at the top: Office of Unilateral Development. I looked up at the secretary, who was standing at the head of the table with his jacket off and his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which in 40 years of government service meant he was done being formal. He said, "We are not appealing the vote." Nobody in the room reacted. I think everyone had already known that. He said, "We are also not going to wait for the quarantine to be lifted by goodwill or political change. We are going to make the quarantine irrelevant." Leon Price leaned forward and said, "That is technically already underway." He opened his own folder and laid out a series of charts that looked at first like navigation maps. They were not navigation maps. They were trajectory probability models for routes through what the Council classified as dead space, the vast stretches of the galaxy that fell outside any recognized transit corridor, unmarked on official charts, because no registered species had found them commercially valuable enough to claim. The Council did not monitor dead space. There was no regulation for it, because the assumption was that nobody wanted to go there. Leon said, "There are 14 viable freight routes through unclaimed space that connect Earth to non-Council markets. They are longer than Council-approved corridors. Some of them add 8 to 12 days of travel time. They are also completely outside Council jurisdiction, which means they are completely outside Council law." Nadia was already nodding. She said, "Anything that happens in unclaimed space is not covered by the developmental quarantine. The quarantine restricts our access to Council space and Council member infrastructure. It says nothing about space that the Council has never formally claimed or charted, because the Council never imagined we would bother." Oliver Strand said quietly, "They forgot that we bother." The secretary said, "Mara, we want you to run this office." I had expected something like that. I said, "What is the scope?" He said, "Everything that falls outside normal diplomatic channels, which right now is everything. You will have legal cover from Nadia's team, technical support from Leon's, and logistics from Oliver. You will operate without a public mandate. You will not apologize for anything you do within the framework of interstellar law. And the framework, as Nadia has been demonstrating for the past year, has a great deal more room in it than the Council would prefer." I looked around the table. Leon was already drawing on his charts. Nadia was making notes. Grace Hewitt was looking at the ceiling with the expression of someone composing a speech she would never have to give because the situation would resolve before she needed it. Oliver Strand was watching me with mild, patient eyes. I said, "All right." We worked for 16 hours that first day. By the end of it, we had preliminary agreements with 3 non-Council species who operated in the outer territories, 2 of them struggling under Council trade fees they had always resented and never had leverage to fight. The agreements were simple. Earth would offer preferred access to our manufacturing technology and our medical databases in exchange for transit rights through their territorial space. No Council approval required. No Council notification required. Completely legal, breathtakingly effective. On the second day, something happened that I had not anticipated, which is the best kind of thing. One of the 3 specialists came to me with a report from our monitoring teams. It showed that 4 Council member species, specifically the Keth hegemony, the Morin collective, the Suvari Republic, and a smaller species called the Hot, had been quietly purchasing Earth-manufactured goods through third-party intermediaries for the past 9 years. Nothing illegal, just very discreet. The goods in question were medical filtration systems, atmospheric processors, and a type of nutritional compound that Leon's team had developed as a side project, and which, it turned out, was the only effective treatment for a degenerative condition that affected approximately 12% of the Keth population. The developmental quarantine had stopped those purchases, not dramatically, not with any announcement. It had simply made the third-party routes too expensive to maintain. I read the report twice. Then I went to Oliver Strand and said, "How quickly can we quietly let the Keth know that we are aware of this situation?" He said, "Do you want them to know we know? Or do you want them to know we know, and that we are not going to use it against them?" I said the second one, but I want them to understand that we could. He said he would have something by morning. On the fourth day, a council monitoring fleet arrived at the edge of Earth's new outer routes. 6 ships, medium class. They positioned themselves at the entrance to the 3 busiest corridors. The intent was clear. The intent was to make us feel watched. I asked Nadia to review the positioning. She came back 2 hours later and told me the fleet had anchored in a section of space that fell, by 0.2 degrees of longitudinal mapping, inside a territory that Earth had claimed for weather satellite placement 7 years ago during a routine expansion. Which meant the Council fleet was, technically and according to the exact same mapping standards, the Council had ratified in their own founding charter, parked in human territorial space without permission. I said, what do we do with that? She said, nothing forceful. We just file the mapping discrepancy with the Council's own cartography office, politely, with documentation, and we ask in the most courteous possible language whether they would like to relocate or whether they would prefer we treat this as an accidental trespass under Article 14 of the Boundary Convention, which the Council wrote. I said send it. The Council fleet relocated within 18 hours. No statement was issued. No explanation was given. They simply moved. And somewhere in that movement, I understood something important. They had expected us to protest loudly, to push emotionally, to do something reactive that they could document and use as evidence of unpredictable aggression. They had not expected us to open a book and show them their own footnotes. On the 7th day, Ambassador Sol made contact. It was not through official channels. It came through a private data packet addressed to my personal research terminal at the Climate Center, routed through 4 relay points that were technically in unclaimed space. I almost missed it. It was labeled as a survey request for astrophysical data, which is the most boring possible label, which meant he had chosen it deliberately. I opened it. It was a short message. It read, "You are moving at the right speed. Do not accelerate yet. There are 3 council members in early private discussions about the sustainability of the quarantine. 2 of them need more time. 1 of them will not change their mind but will stop objecting if they feel they were not pressured. You will know the moment when it is safe to move faster. I will not tell you when that is. You will feel it." I sat with that for a long time. Then I saved it under Astrophysical Survey Data, subfolder 7, and went back to work. By the end of the first month, Earth had 14 active trade agreements with non-council species, 3 of which included mutual defense provisions that had been drafted so carefully by Nadia's team that they were legally indistinguishable from cultural exchange arrangements unless you read the appendices. Our freight was moving. Our economy was adjusting. Scientists at the propulsion division were already talking about a new drive concept that had emerged as a side effect of the rerouting calculations, something about field geometry that Leon could not stop smiling about. The Council had expected the quarantine to make us quiet. Instead, for the first time in decades, nobody was telling us what we were allowed to do. We had forgotten a little what that felt like. We were remembering fast. 18 months, that was all it took. I know that sounds fast. From the outside, looking at the history books later, it probably looks like a series of clean, decisive moves made by very smart people who knew exactly what they were doing. I want to be honest about what it actually felt like from the inside. It felt like running. Not panicked running, not frightened running, but the kind of running you do when you have finally been let off a restriction you didn't deserve, and the ground is flat and your legs are working, and there is a great deal of open space in front of you. It felt like being alive. I want to tell you about the moon first, because the moon was when I knew something had fundamentally shifted. Not Earth's moon, a rogue moon, technically designated X447c on the Council's old stellar maps, which sat in a slow drift orbit through unclaimed space about 6 transit days from Earth's outer boundary. It had a stable atmosphere, low gravity, and absolutely no strategic or commercial value that the Council had ever identified. We had been using it as a relay station for about 3 years. Then Leon's team noticed that the specific combination of low gravity and stable magnetic field made it very good for certain kinds of materials research that were difficult to do in Earth's gravity well. Then, an education foundation asked if they could use one of the relay station's secondary buildings for a research residency program. Then the residency program attracted 43 researchers from 11 different species, 6 of which were not council members, and 3 of which were technically council members but operating in a private capacity. 6 months after that, it was a university. It did not have a formal name yet. The researchers called it the station. It had 4 permanent buildings, a greenhouse module, a library that was mostly digital but had 2 shelves of actual physical books that someone had brought as a joke and which had become unexpectedly precious, and a student population of 112 beings from 19 different species. They were studying everything from propulsion theory to interspecies ecology to something that the Velhari students called resonant philosophy, which I still did not fully understand, but which seemed to involve a great deal of sitting quietly near other people and paying attention. The council could not object to the university. It was in unclaimed space. It was private. It involved no official government bodies. It was simply a group of curious people who had found a moon and decided it was a good place to learn things. But the council noticed it. I know they noticed it, because one of the reports that came across my desk 2 months in included a council communications intercept showing that 3 separate council intelligence offices had filed separate reports about X447C, and all 3 reports had used the same phrase: cultural contagion risk. There it was again, that phrase. I was starting to think it was the most honest thing they had ever said about us. While the university was growing, Oliver Strand was building something that we had taken to calling the Outer Compact, though that name was not official yet. It had started as a loose network of trade agreements, the kind of thing that looked, from a legal distance, like a collection of individual bilateral arrangements between Earth and various non-council species. Nadia had structured it that way on purpose. 14 agreements that were each individually unremarkable but which, taken together, formed a system: shared trade protocols, mutual recognition of territorial boundaries, a joint process for resolving disputes, a data-sharing arrangement for navigational hazards, and nested quietly in the appendix of the 7th agreement, a mutual assistance clause that said, in careful, measured language, that any member of the arrangement would offer non-military support to any other member facing a disruptive external restriction on their trade or movement. The Council's legal team had reviewed each agreement individually. They had found nothing objectionable in any of them. They had not reviewed them as a system, because the idea of 14 separate bilateral arrangements forming a coherent governing framework was, apparently, not a possibility that had occurred to them. I thought about that a lot. I thought about how hard it must be to miss something that is sitting right in front of you, and I decided it was only hard if you assumed the other party was not that clever. They had made that assumption about us. It was going to cost them. The moment when the Outer Compact became publicly real was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because I had a meeting that morning about water reclamation systems for the X447C University that ran 40 minutes over schedule and made me late for everything else. Oliver Strand came into my office at noon with the look of someone who had been waiting patiently to deliver news that he found personally satisfying. He said, "The Council has formally acknowledged the compact." I said, "How?" He said, "They issued a strongly worded statement calling it an unregistered political body, operating without Council authorization, and requesting that member species immediately clarify their legal status." I said, "And?" He said, 11 of our 14 members have responded. All 11 said, in various ways, that they did not require council authorization because they were not applying for it. 3 of the responses included very polite references to the sections of council founding law that establish the right of non-member species to form independent arrangements. Nadia wrote 2 of the responses herself. She is, by the way, extremely satisfied right now. I said, what about the council's request for the compact to register as a political body? Oliver said, the compact does not have a headquarters, a central governing body, a unified military structure, a shared currency, or a flag. It therefore does not meet the council's own definition of a political body requiring registration. We are, legally speaking, a very large and well-organized collection of friends. I sat back in my chair. I said, that is beautiful. He said, Nadia wants it on a poster. The next significant moment came from a direction I had not expected, which was the sky. Leon Price called me at 11 in the evening on a Thursday with the energy of someone who had not slept in 2 days and did not intend to sleep for 2 more. He said, Mara, you need to come to the lab. I drove to the propulsion center in the dark. Leon met me at the door with coffee and a data tablet showing a series of numbers that meant nothing to me at first. He walked me through it in the next 2 hours. The rerouting calculations, the ones his team had been running for 18 months to find the most efficient paths through unclaimed space, had produced an unexpected result. The field geometry required to make those routes viable at high speed was subtly but significantly different from standard corridor travel. It had forced his engineers to rethink their assumptions about how a drive system interacted with low-density space. And in the process of rethinking those assumptions, they had found something new. Not new as in we improved an existing system. New as in we had been solving the wrong equation for 30 years and here was the correct one. The new drive was, conservatively, 40% faster than anything currently in use. It required less fuel. It was more stable in irregular space. And it had emerged entirely as a byproduct of being cut off from the council's infrastructure and being forced to find our own way through the parts of the galaxy that nobody else had bothered to optimize. I asked Leon how long before it could be deployed on freight vessels. He said 8 months probably. I asked how long before the council would know about it. He said they already knew something was happening. The route efficiency data was public. The fact that our freight was moving faster than their models predicted was observable. But they did not know why yet, and by the time they figured it out, every ship in the outer compact's network would already have the upgrade. I said, does this make our ships faster than their patrol fleet? Leon looked at his coffee. He said, their patrol fleet, their monitoring vessels, and their diplomatic courier ships, yes. He paused. This is not something we should use as a threat, Mara. I want to be clear about that. I said, I know. It is something better than a threat. It is a fact. Back on the diplomatic side, I made a trip to the Velhari homeworld. It was not an official visit. Officially, I was attending an academic conference on interspecies linguistic evolution, which was a real conference, and which I did, in fact, attend for the first morning session before the more important work began. Sol met me in a garden at the edge of the conference facility. He was older than he had looked in the council chamber. Up close, the amber in his eyes was deeper, the color of old stone in afternoon light. We sat in something that functioned like chairs. Around us, the Velhari city moved in its quiet, layered way, sound coming in waves that seemed to fold around each other. He said, you have been careful. I said, you asked me to be. He said, 3 members are now in open private discussion. One of them is the Keth senior representative. I thought of the medical filtration systems, the nutritional compound, 12% of the Keth population. I said, are they moving toward reconsideration or toward damage control? He said, there is a version of reconsideration that looks exactly like damage control until the moment it stops being damage control. I believe they are approaching that moment. I said, "What do you need from me?" He said, "Do not make any statement about the council for 30 days. Let the compact speak for itself. Let the university speak for itself. Let the routes and the ships and the agreements speak for themselves. The council is beginning to hear something it has not heard in a long time." I asked what that was. He said, "The sound of a structure that is no longer the only one." I flew home on a compact-flagged vessel, which was a human freighter with a small compact registration emblem on the hull, which was a detail that Oliver Strand had added 3 months ago, and which I had thought was premature at the time, and did not think was premature anymore. On the way back, I reread the charges from the original vote: unpredictable evolutionary aggression, resource monopolization behavior, cultural contagion risk. I thought about the university on the rogue moon, full of young Velhari sitting quietly with young humans and learning each other's languages, and then making new ones. I thought about the routes running clean and fast through the parts of space nobody had wanted. I thought about the compact, spread wide and structureless and untouchable. I thought about Leon's drive humming in the belly of the ship I was sitting in. I thought about cultural contagion risk, and for the first time I let myself smile about it. They had tried to contain us. They had instead given us the most productive 18 months in the history of human interstellar presence. I landed on Earth in the early morning. The sun was just coming up over the eastern mountains, and the light was the color of warm water, and someone at the freight terminal had left a pot of coffee on a table near the gate with a handwritten note that said, "Help yourself." I poured a cup. I had 30 days to be quiet, and then the second part of this was going to begin, and I was going to be ready for it. The meeting with High Arbiter Vess started 20 minutes late. I had arrived on time. This was deliberate. I had also worn the same gray diplomatic coat I had worn the day of the vote, which I had kept specifically for a moment like this, because I believed in the particular kind of message that continuity sends. I was the same person. The coat was the same coat. What had changed was everything around me. Vess arrived looking like a being who had recently discovered that a room he thought he controlled had quietly grown a second floor while he was not looking. The Dravasi were tall, angular beings with a natural authority in their posture that came from a civilization that had never really been seriously tested from outside. Vess had held the role of High Arbiter for 14 years. He was considered, within the council, to be both reasonable and formidable. He had asked for this meeting 6 weeks ago. I had agreed to it 3 weeks ago and scheduled it for this week, which put us 14 weeks total from the request to the conversation. I want to be clear that this was not pettiness. It was accuracy. I needed those 14 weeks to be exactly as productive as they were, and they were very productive. We met in a neutral facility on a small station that technically belonged to the Suvari Republic, one of our compact members, though Vess did not know that detail yet. The room was simple: a table, 2 chairs, a window looking out at a stretch of quiet space. Vess sat down and placed a formal document case on the table. He said, in his own language, which I understood well enough that I did not use my earpiece, "Ambassador Voss, thank you for making time." I said, "Of course." He said, "The council would like to discuss the conditions under which the developmental quarantine might be reviewed." I said, "I appreciate that." He said, "We believe that a structured process of re-engagement could benefit all parties. We would be prepared to consider a phased lifting of the quarantine in exchange for certain commitments regarding the outer compact's activities." I said, "I see. What kind of commitments?" Vess opened his document case and produced a single page. He slid it across the table. I picked it up and read it carefully. It asked the outer compact to register as a formal political body under council jurisdiction. It asked Earth to submit future trade agreements with non-council species for council review before finalization. and it asked for a delay on the new drive technology being shared with compact members until a council technical committee could review its implications. I put the page down. I said, I want to make sure I understand this correctly. The council is offering to lift a quarantine that is currently unenforceable in exchange for us voluntarily placing ourselves inside a regulatory framework that the quarantine was meant to simulate. Vess was very still. He said, the quarantine remains a valid legal instrument. I said the quarantine required your patrol fleet to be able to maintain interdiction. The patrol fleet is currently slower than our freight ships and cannot intercept our routes, several of which pass through space that your own cartography office has confirmed is outside council jurisdiction. I am not saying this to be difficult. I am saying it so we are both working from the same set of facts. Vess said, capability is not the only instrument of governance. I said you are right, which is why I want to show you something. I placed my own document on the table. It was the Outer Compact Charter, printed on actual paper, which was an unusual choice that I had made because the weight of it in your hands meant something. I opened it to the annex that Nadia and Oliver and I had spent 3 weeks writing and rewriting until it was exactly right. I said the Outer Compact has, as of last month, received private applications from 7 species who are currently full council members. I am not going to tell you which 7. You will find out in time. What I want you to understand is that this is not happening because we pressured them. It is happening because those 7 species have done the math. They are looking at our route network, our trade growth rates, our university, our technology development pace, and they are asking themselves a question. Vess said, what question? I said, which structure do I want to be part of? There was a silence, the kind of silence that means something is changing. I said the annex I am showing you is a new membership clause. The compact is open to any civilization that accepts its founding principles. Equal standing, mutual respect, no developmental quarantines, no hierarchical membership tiers. I paused. This includes council members. It includes the council itself as individual species. There is no requirement to leave the council to join the compact. There is no disagreement in this offer. We are not trying to replace you. We are trying to be neighbors. Vess looked at the page for a long time. He said, you are describing a parallel governing structure. I said I am describing an alternative, which is a different thing. A parallel structure implies competition. An alternative implies choice. We are offering a choice. He said, what happens if enough council members choose the compact? I said, then the compact becomes the primary diplomatic framework for a majority of space-faring civilizations, yes. But Vess, that is a consequence of those civilizations making their own decisions. It is not something we are doing to the council. It is something the council's own choices made possible. I met his eyes. The vote against us was 2 years ago. In those 2 years, we built 14 trade routes, 12 bilateral agreements, a university with students from 19 species, and a drive technology that has changed the economics of interstellar transit. We did all of that because you gave us no other option. We were not looking for a conflict. We are still not looking for one. We are just very, very good at finding a way forward. Vess said quietly, the charges against Earth included cultural contagion risk. I said yes. He said, looking at the past 2 years, do you think that charge was incorrect? I thought about the university. I thought about the young Velhari learning human languages and the young humans learning to sit quietly in the Velhari way. I thought about the compact, spread across unclaimed space in that wide, unsupervised, beautiful way. I thought about Leon's drive, discovered in the middle of necessity. I said I think the charge was entirely correct. I think we do change things around us. I think ideas we carry, ways we solve problems, ways we treat each other spread outward. I think that is true. I paused. I just think calling it a risk was the wrong word. The right word was consequence, and the question was never whether it would happen. The question was whether you would be part of it. Vess looked at the charter for another long moment. Then he closed it gently and slid it back to me. He said, "I need time." I said, "Take what you need. The offer does not expire." He stood to leave. At the door he paused without turning around, and he said, in a voice that was quieter than his official register, "If the council had not voted the way it did 2 years ago, what would you have done?" I said, "Sat down at your table, worked within your system, probably argued with you about 17 things and agreed on 12 of them and made something reasonable. I picked up the compact charter and held it. We are not difficult people. We just do not stay still when you lock the door." He left. I sat in the room alone for a few minutes, looking out the window at the stretch of quiet space. Somewhere out there, on X447C, a student from a species whose name required 4 seconds to pronounce was sitting in a classroom built on a rogue moon, learning astrophysics from a human instructor who had grown up in a small town in Kent. Somewhere out there, a compact freighter was running a route that had not existed 2 years ago, carrying medical supplies to a planet that the Council's shipping network had never bothered serving efficiently. Somewhere out there, 14 Council members were in private conversations that Vess did not know about yet, and 2 of them were going to issue a public statement in 11 days. I knew about the statement because Sol had told me. He was not supposed to tell me. He had told me anyway, because at some point in the past 2 years he had decided that I was someone worth telling things to, and I had decided that he was someone worth being honest with, and that was a small and quiet thing, but it was also the foundation of everything else. Nadia called me as I was leaving the station. She said, "How did it go?" I said, "He needs time." She said, "Do we give it to him?" I said, "Yes. We are not in a hurry. We have a university, a drive, 14 routes and 12 agreements, and the 7 council members who applied for compact membership last month have been joined by 2 more while I was sitting in that meeting." There was a brief silence. Then Nadia said, with the calm satisfaction of a person who has been right about something for a very long time, "I told you the appendices mattered." I said, "You were correct. You are always correct. Please stop reminding me." She said, "I will stop when it stops being true." I smiled. I walked to the transit bay. The compact ship was waiting, engine warm, crew of 4, hull bearing that small registration emblem that meant something now in a way it had not 2 years ago. The pilot, a young woman named Diane who had grown up on one of the outer stations and had never in her life waited for council approval to go anywhere, gave me a nod when I came aboard. I buckled in. She said, "Where to?" I said, "Home, but take the long route. I want to check on the university." Diane said, "The moon." I said, "The moon." She opened the throttle and the compact ship, with its quiet new engine, moved into the dark. The formal session was held on a Wednesday. I remember the day clearly because it was raining in New Geneva when I got the notification, a slow warm rain that turned the streets the color of old silver, and I was standing at the window of the Climate Modeling Center watching it when my terminal chimed. I looked down and saw the header. Council Session 774. Agenda: Review of Developmental Quarantine, Article 9, Earth and Affiliated Territories. Proposed motion: full rescission. Proposed by 12 member species, seconded by 9 more. I put my terminal down on the window ledge and kept watching the rain for a moment. There is something that happens in your body when a thing you have been working toward for a very long time becomes real. It is not exactly joy, at least not immediately. It is something quieter. It is the sensation of weight leaving. I picked up the terminal and called Nadia. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she had been waiting. She said, "I see it." I said, 21 sponsors. She said, 23 now. The Suvari just signed on while we were talking. I said, "Do we need to attend?" She said, "We were not invited. We are still under quarantine until the vote passes, but Sol has a transmission reserved for the Open Gallery channel. He asked me to tell you to listen. I sat at my desk and opened the gallery feed at the scheduled time. The council chamber looked the same as it always had, that vast cold room with its tiered shadows. But there were differences. In the observation sections that lined the upper gallery, there were faces I did not recognize from previous sessions. Some of them were Velhari. Some were from species I knew to be compact members. They had been given observer status, which was a small thing technically and a large thing in every other way. Sol stood to address the chamber. He was slower than he had been 2 years ago, and his voice was the same, deep and careful, with the specific gravity of someone who chose every word like they were placing tools back in the exact right position. He said the following. He said, 2 years ago this chamber voted to restrict Earth's participation in galactic society. The charges were real. The fear behind them was real. I abstained from that vote not because I was indifferent to the concerns expressed, but because I believed the decision being made was a larger one than the votes being cast. We were not simply deciding whether to admit a species. We were deciding what kind of civilization we wanted to be. We decided to be the kind that responds to difference with restriction. I believed that decision would have consequences we had not fully considered. I have spent 2 years watching those consequences arrive. He paused. The chamber was very quiet. He said, Earth did not respond to the quarantine with aggression. They responded with invention. They did not attempt to force their way into our system. They built a different system. They did not challenge our rules. They operated in the spaces our rules had never considered because we had assumed incorrectly that those spaces were not worth considering. The outer compact which Earth helped establish is not our opposition. It is the evidence of our failure to be generous. And the generosity it would have taken to include them costs us far less than the 2 years we have spent watching them demonstrate that they do not need us. He paused again. He said, I am supporting the rescission motion. I would ask my colleagues who have not yet decided to consider not only what Earth did with the past 2 years, but what we did. We spent those years trying to make a quarantine hold that we could not enforce, managing a political fracture that our own decision created, and watching a new framework grow in the space we left empty. If this is what happens when we work against Earth, imagine what happens when we work with them. The vote was called 40 minutes later. 31 in favor of rescission, 9 against, 7 abstentions. The quarantine was lifted. I did not celebrate when I heard. That might seem strange, but there was nothing to celebrate in the sense of a victory over someone. The council members who had voted against us 2 years ago were not our opponents. Most of them had voted out of a fear that was, in its own way, understandable. A species that had evolved the way humans had, that fast, that stubborn, that relentlessly creative, is a species that is very difficult to predict. They had not been wrong that we change things. They had only been wrong about whether change was something to be contained. What I felt when the vote came through was not triumph. It was relief. And then, immediately after, it was purpose, because the rescission was not an ending. It was an opening. 2 days after the vote, Nadia submitted the Outer Compact's formal notification to the Council's registry office. Not as a registration, because the Compact did not require Council registration. As a notification of existence, filed under the same provision of Council law that allowed any non-member body to declare itself to Council authorities for purposes of diplomatic transparency. It was a courtesy. The Compact was under no legal obligation to send it. We sent it because it was the right thing to do. The notification included a full list of member species, the complete charter, the membership annex with its open-door policy, and a brief cover letter that Nadia had written and that I had read 3 times and approved without changing a single word. The cover letter said, "The Outer Compact is not a response to the Council. It is a response to the galaxy. We are here for anyone who would like to come with us." I returned to X447C 2 weeks after the vote. The university had grown since my last visit. There was a new dormitory wing, a greenhouse that had been expanded twice, and a small public square that someone had built between the main research building and the library. With low seats made from the moon's native mineral and a simple fountain that recycled its own water in the low gravity, in a way that produced a continuous slow arc of droplets that caught the light from the nearby star. Several students were sitting in the square when I arrived, working, talking, watching the fountain. Sol's granddaughter was among them. Her name was Leth. She was young by Velhari standards, curious in the way that young Velhari often are, with the amber eyes of her family and a precision in her speech that told me she had been paying careful attention to her grandfather for her entire life. She had enrolled in the university's diplomatic studies program 3 months ago. The program had been designed by a human professor, a Velhari senior advisor, and a Keth legal scholar working together, which meant it was rigorous and unlike any curriculum that had existed before. She saw me cross the square and came to meet me. She said, "Ambassador Voss, we heard about the vote." I said, "Good news travels." She said, "My grandfather asked me to give you something." She handed me a small sealed envelope, actual paper, which was becoming a habit among the Velhari who wanted to communicate something important. I opened it. Inside was a single card. On it, in Sol's careful handwriting in standard common, were the words, "You moved at the right speed." I folded it and put it in my coat pocket. Leth said, "What do you do now that the quarantine is gone?" I looked at the fountain, at the slow arc of water catching the starlight. I looked at the students in the square, a dozen species represented in that small circle, each of them working on something that interested them enough to travel to a rogue moon to study it. I said the same thing we always do: figure out what everyone said was impossible and then do it anyway. She said, "Everyone used to say the compact was impossible." I said, "Yes." She said, "And before that, they said your trade routes were impossible." I said, "Yes." She said, "And before that, they said the drive was impossible, and the university and the agreements." I said, "Yes, they said all of those things." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is there anything that actually is impossible for humans?" I thought about that seriously. I thought about the vote, the dark council chamber, the 47. I thought about Leon in his workshop with paint-stained fingers, smiling at an equation that nobody had asked him to solve. I thought about Nadia's 400-page brief in Oliver's patient eyes and Grace Hewitt sitting at a table saying nothing but meaning everything. I thought about Diane opening the throttle in the dark, no council permission required, running a route through the stars that nobody had named yet. I said, "Honestly, Leth, I am not sure, but we keep looking for the edges." She smiled. It was the Velhari version of a smile, subtle and precise, the expression of someone who has just learned something they intend to keep. Around us, the university hummed with the particular energy of a place where people are finding things out. The fountain turned its quiet arc of light. The stars were out beyond the dome, close and patient and full of unclaimed space that nobody had gotten around to exploring yet. I had a meeting with Leon in 3 hours about the second generation of the drive. Oliver was drafting the compact's expansion proposal for the territories beyond the outer boundary. Nadia was writing a brief, her longest one yet, on the legal status of artificial habitats in unclaimed space, which was going to matter very much in about 18 months. And somewhere in the council chamber on the far side of a transit corridor that no longer had a patrol fleet blocking it, a conversation was beginning that had started with fear and was slowly, carefully, honestly becoming something else entirely. We had not won anything. We had made something. That, in my experience, is always better. Leth asked if she could walk with me to the research building. I said yes. We walked across the square, past the fountain, past the students solving the problems they had come here to solve, under a sky that was thick with stars that had, as of 3 weeks ago, a little more room in them for the rest of us. I was not finished. I was not even close to finished. But for a single moment, walking across a rogue moon in the quiet light of a distant star, with a young Velhari beside me asking good questions, I let myself feel exactly how far we had come. Then I set it aside, because there was work to do. There is always work to do. That is, I have come to believe, our greatest quality and our most reliable engine. Humans do not stop. We do not run out of problems to solve or distances to cross or doors to open that were meant to stay closed. We are not the strongest species in the galaxy, not the oldest, not the most patient by nature, though we can learn patience when we have to. But we are, without question, the most relentlessly, stubbornly, joyfully forward-moving people that this galaxy has ever produced. They voted against us. They thought it would slow us down. It turned out to be the most useful thing they ever did for us. The compact now has 27 member species. The university on X447C has 411 students and a waiting list for next year. The new drive is standard on 40% of compact vessels and growing. The Council, as of last month, has 3 of its own member species formally enrolled in the compact as dual members, the first time in the Council's history that its members have simultaneously held membership in another governing framework. Vess sent me a message last week. It was short. It said, "You were right about the word. It was not risk. It was consequence." And then, after a pause, a second line, "We would like to send an observer to the university's next symposium." I wrote back, "The door is open. It always was." And that, more than anything else, is the thing I want people to understand about the past 2 years. We were never trying to overcome anyone. We were never interested in building something exclusive or powerful in the way power is usually measured, in control and restriction, and the ability to say no to the people who ask to be included. We wanted to build something that worked, something honest, something that could hold the weight of all the different kinds of people who wanted to come and be part of it, without requiring any of them to be smaller than they were. The galaxy is large, there is room. We were just the ones who decided to use it.